What is going on to all my Barry fans out there, and welcome back to my channel, MovieFiles. We are back breaking down this fourth and final season of Barry and discussing the second episode titled Bestest Place on Earth. Now, after completing episode 1, which you can catch my breakdown on that in the description of this video, and of course finishing this second episode, what a perfect set of episodes to kick off this fourth and final season, and this one in particular sets up the plot in such a perfect way. We got so much to go over, but before we get into it, I want to know your thoughts on the second episode in the comment section. Your score for the episode, what were your pros, your cons, the deeper meanings you all took away from this episode, and of course, what theories and predictions do you all have for the weeks ahead, and if you all had to pick between episode 1 and 2, which was your favorite? Let's talk about that in the comment section. And of course, if you all appreciate today's breakdown, consider hitting the like button, sharing today's breakdown, and consider subscribing to the channel. With all that being said, we got a second episode to break down. Full spoilers ahead. We open this episode with Barry, who's all bandaged up in his cell. As he lightly bangs his head against the concrete wall, he sees his younger self on the bed playing with his toys. Now we head back to that desert land that we saw in episode 1, and it is confirmed that the man that was calling his name from a distance is Barry's father, who goes by the name of John, as we see John is introducing young Barry to Fuchs for the first time. Now in this conversation, I don't know if you all noticed, but John says that Barry is his youngest son, which to me implies that Barry has either a sibling or siblings out there, and I'm very curious if we're going to meet them in this fourth and final season. Let's talk about Sally and what she's got going on in this episode as she meets with her previous agent to get back into business, but the Sally business isn't a good business to be in right now as her rant is still a very hot topic, but then you add in the Barry of the situation, which just adds more fuel to her career, which is on fire, but not in a good way. Now, her ex-agent brings up how Sally is forever linked to Barry and that she will be forever known as the see you next Tuesday girl who was dating a serial killer, but it's not a career killer. She tells her that she can maybe do a reality show or do a podcast out of this, which, by the way, just a side note, it is so true in Hollywood how we have sometimes celebrities being canceled, but then as soon as they do a TV show about what happened or from their perspective or even doing a podcast, they manage to make their way back into the spotlight, something that we see all the time. But the question is, in this moment, will Sally reset her career and start to monetize off this situation, or will she leave her dreams behind her, or will she take the advice that Gene gives her, which we'll be discussing a little bit later? Switching over to two of my favorite characters, and that's Hank and Cristobal. As we see, Cristobal is meeting with an old associate by the name of Bong, and he wants to get a meeting with him and the Guatemalans who happen to be in war with each other, but Cristobal manages to get them together after setting up the meeting at the best place on earth, which is no other than Dave and Buster's. Now, seeing the back and forth and the handoff between Cristobal and Hank and their poetry emotion was just so great, but also hilarious at the same time, as they tell the two rival gangs they have to realize their weaknesses and work together like Hank and Cristobal did in the past. But the funniest thing to me in this scene was they're in a public setting during lunchtime hours saying all these criminal activities that they've done in the past, and nobody, not even the waiter is noticing what they're talking about, which was just so funny to me, as they're ordering jalapeno poppers for the whole table, and bang, they get it done as the gang decides to work together and they celebrate by playing games together. Again, this whole scene was the funniest moment to me in this episode. But while that's happening, we see Hank, as I predicted in my episode 1 breakdown. He is working to get a plan in motion to get Barry out of prison, and we see Hank's connection, Toro, tells him all he needs is manpower, which, as I said in my episode 1 breakdown, that I figured that this would be a conflict between Hank and Cristobal in regards to getting Barry out of prison. But I don't want to skip over this Easter egg for a future character appearing in a future episode. Now, the name Toro, does that ring a bell to you all out there? Well, if you all don't know this was a rumor that surfaced online, which was director, one of my favorite directors in Hollywood, Guillermo del Toro, is casted in HBO's Barry in the fourth and final season. And I think this pretty much confirms that we will be seeing Guillermo del Toro making his appearance in this fourth and final season as Hank's friend Toro to get Barry out of prison. I could be completely wrong, but I think I will be right. Guillermo del Toro, the rumors were out there last year. I think we're going to be seeing him in the future. But as we see Cristobal and Hank talking about their plan for sand and presenting it in front of the crew, and they tell them that there will be no funny business, there will be no crimes committed, but instead this will be a legit business they can do in the light and they can become solid citizens. But as we know, Hank throws in at the last minute. He says that they're going to do one more thing, which is breaking out their best assassin, which is Barry, and we see Cristobal is completely caught off guard, because this completely goes against Cristobal's plans to do this in a legit way and to break no laws. But we see Hank yelling out "Prison Break 2023" as they cover their microphones to discuss this surprise, as the gang is watching them and they're not on the same page and they have this fight, which again, they're hilarious. I love this scene. It was the funniest part of this episode and I love these characters. But speaking of not being on the same page, let's cut to what's going on with Barry and Fuchs, who we see him meeting with the FBI, and he's not going to complete the deal that he made with them because he doesn't want to turn his back on his friend, as he mentions that he has his new attorney by the name of Gale. And you'll notice that the FBI was caught by surprise and they got a little bit nervous when Gale's name get brought up, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But see, Fuchs, aka the Raven, introduces the inmates to Barry and announces his connections to the Chechens, and if they join him and Barry, Fuchs promises to give them a piece of the pie when they all get out. Now, as he tries to recruit the gang and assign them some terrible nicknames like Jason and LimeWire, again, that moment was just so funny to me. But I will say, just speaking of the comedy of it all in this moment and in this episode, compared to episode 1, which was more of a serious and more dramatic episode, I really do like how this one kind of took it back a little bit and gave us a little bit more funnier moments. And I definitely think between the two episodes, episode 2 was the funniest. Now, Barry and Fuchs have a chat about their game plan to protect themselves while the lawyer gets everything set up. And as we see right now, Barry has fallen back into the trap of trusting and falling in line with Fuchs after losing his confidence that he's gained in the past few seasons and losing his connection with Gene and Sally. Which, speaking of Sally, we see that Barry has a visitor, and to my surprise, as well as Barry's surprise, it is Sally herself. Now, we see this conversation between the two characters as she is seeing if Barry's okay, and the first thing he says to her is just immediately apologizing for what happened, as Sally tells him that the only reason she flew out here to see him in prison was to check on their dog by the name of Muffin, which was code to see if Barry has told anyone about her killing a biker, which Barry assures her that she is safe and he won't tell anyone about her secret. Now, we see Barry is breaking down and he tells her that he technically didn't lie to her, he just didn't tell her this darker side of himself, which he goes on to say that she made him forget how much of a POS he was and that she actually made him feel human again, and he felt the love and appreciated the love that she gave him. We see Sally is getting emotional at this point and she tells him that she left her parents' house and she felt terrible, but more importantly, she tells Barry that Barry made her feel safe. Now, before moving on, I have to say that the acting in the scene was just absolutely incredible. It was so believable, and I just love the back and forth between these two characters as we see that this is what makes Barry happy to hear these words, as we see Sally is removing the phone from her ear and Barry's telling her that he loves her so many times, but she ultimately leaves, and he says to her that she will always be safe around him. Now, I personally believe that Barry was okay with the idea of spending the rest of his life in prison for everything that he's done and going along with Fuchs and all his plans and whatnot, but it was after this conversation with Sally that he got the motivation he needed to find any way possible to get back to his Sally. Now, we cut back to Barry having a brief flashback or dream sequence where he sees Fuchs, who's telling him that lunch is ready, but at the same time, we see that there's a wedding taking place, and the transition between the sand and going to the wedding, it was just so beautiful, and Bill Hader's direction is just so incredible. But we see Barry imagining growing old with Sally and dancing at the wedding, and I assume that their kids were probably getting married, as this was a similar dream that Barry had the night that him and Sally hooked up for the first time back in season 1. Check in on what's going on with Gene as he's setting up all these little notes with instructions for the meeting with the reporter to discuss the most mind-blowing story of his career, as the location is no other than their old stomping grounds, which is the acting class. And we see Gene claims that he doesn't want the spotlight and he only wants to tell the story that he knows how, which is acting on stage, and he recreates the first time that he met Barry. Now, to me, this scene implies that Gene has gone back to his old ways and he really hasn't changed. And I think that that's really the big thing about this episode, is seeing these characters kind of reverting back to their old stomping grounds. And we see Gene is going back to lying to Jim and exploiting the situation, what happened to Janice. And by the way, going back to the comedic beats, him impersonating Barry in this scene on stage was just so funny. And we see that the reporter is actually impressed and buying into his story. But wrapping all these plots up as we approach the end of this episode, we see Fuchs with his lawyer Gail, who seems to have these very unorthodox methods to winning his court cases by confusing the judge and the jury, and he really doesn't care if his clients are innocent or guilty as long as he wins. We see that Fuchs is getting all this set up. Meanwhile, Barry's running late. That's because Barry is meeting with the FBI to cut a deal after having that dream of spending the rest of his life and growing old with Sally, as Barry is willing to give them all the details of all his hit jobs, but the only thing that he requests in return is that when he gets enrolled in the witness protection program, that he is able to take one person with him. And I think it's safe to assume that that one person will be Sally, and that is good old pal Fuchs. Which, if you ask me, I think if Fuchs find out that he chose Sally over him, I wouldn't be surprised if Fuchs ends up trying to get Sally killed. Now, at this point, we see Gene is sweating as he's taking some creative liberties and telling this story to the reporter, who's again eating all this up. But the funny part of this whole thing is, I would imagine that story was probably hours long, and we see the reporter kind of summarize it all perfectly in one sentence. We see the reporter tells Gene that he will be an anonymous source, which I don't think that will be true, and we'll see what comes of all that. But we see that Sally is in the background, and we have this conversation between Sally and Gene as she is mad because he never told her about Barry, and we see Gene pushes back against her, even noticing a single sign of Barry being the killer. And of course she didn't notice, because we know that Sally was so focused on her career. And Gene says probably one of the most honest things he said, not only in this episode but maybe of the entire series, as he says that Barry was obsessed with the both of them. He treated both of them like superstars, and as they are actors, they couldn't resist this. And I love that scene in this line so much, especially coming from Gene. And we know that Sally knows this to be true as well. I personally don't think that either one of them loved Barry as much as he loved them, especially in their individual relationships. And it was definitely more of a one-way relationship with Barry and Gene and Barry and Sally. And if we're being honest, they pretty much used Barry to boost their egos because he was the ultimate hype man and they loved the attention. So again, I just love that acknowledgement from Gene in this moment. Gene suggests to her that with her back against the wall, she should respond by teaching, which I think implies that she'll be taking over Gene's ex-job as being an acting coach. But I'm not going to lie to you all. For a second there, I thought that Sally was going to maybe snap and possibly hurt or kill Gene in that moment. Let me know if you all were thinking the same thing. But speaking of killing, we see Fuchs heads to Barry's cell and he sees that there is a new inmate there that has replaced Barry because Barry has been moved over to special housing. And we see Fuchs knows that Barry cut the deal that was offered to him that he threw away for their new friendship. As we end the episode with Cristobal and Hank having their discussion about Barry and not being honest with one another, as Hank tells him that Barry just needs their help, and Cristobal says that things like this is what makes Hank look soft in front of the others and that Barry never cared about him, as Hank gets a call from Fuchs and he tells him about the betrayal as he's crying, and honestly he just wanted to do right by Barry for a change. But the key thing is he tells him that Barry is working for the FBI, which would include ratting him and Cristobal out. And now the question is, what will Hank do with this information, as we end on this scene with him going back in the house and he tells Cristobal that they now have to kill Barry. What an incredible back-to-back episodes. And even though we get one less week with Barry, with them giving us episode 1 and 2 back-to-back, which honestly I think it was a genius plan to do that looking at it now, because it plays so well into each other. It plays like a part 1 of a part 2, and this just kind of opening up the whole floodgates for this 4th and final season. Episode 1 to me did such a great job of catching us up emotionally with these characters as they have to reflect on the events of what happened with Barry, and this second episode set up the storylines of Gene going back to his old ways and using this situation as a way to get back on stage to impress a reporter, which I don't think Jim's going to be happy about that. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays into this 4th season. And catching up with Sally in this episode, her going back to her beginnings and telling her side of the story, but this time as a teacher, and maybe she'll try to help others to not go down the path that she went. Which, speaking of the dark path, Cristobal and Hank going back in business, but this time they're trying to do it a different way. But seeing Hank, like episode 1 and season 1, having to get the assignment of killing Barry, and I can just see it right now as they're going to try to break out Barry out of prison, and we're going to probably get one of those super action heavy episodes that will probably blow our minds as we're going to see Barry defending himself, and I cannot wait to see what comes of that. And going back to Barry, and like season 1, him falling head over heels for Sally, but now he's willing to give up everything and give up everybody in hopes to fulfill his dreams of being happy with her and living their lives together. And speaking of living their lives, leaving Fuchs to going back to his old conniving ways and going against Barry and not wanting to let him go, which will be very interesting if we'll get more of those backstories and finding out more about Barry's past. And did Fuchs kill Barry's dad to become Barry's father? I'm very curious to see more of their relationship, and this episode to me was just so great. And again, the back-to-back episodes were fantastic, and I can't wait to see what the rest of the season has up its sleeve. But hey, that's my breakdown for episode 2. I loved it, but I want to know what you all thought about it. Again, your pros, your cons, your thoughts, your theories for the weeks ahead. Do you think Guillermo del Toro is going to pop up? What do you think is going to happen after this second episode? Let's talk about it in the comment section. I appreciate you all watching this breakdown, and if you didn't see my episode 1 breakdown, you can click on the screen now to see that. You can click on the button here to join the community, and also check out all my other previous Barry breakdowns. You all are awesome. Hope you're staying safe. We'll catch you all on the next breakdown.